Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. And I know you, as well as I, are anxious to continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. And before we begin, I want to apologize to my listeners. The latter half of the broadcast yesterday, we had connectivity problems, and the program was interrupted a couple of times. And on that basis, I will back up just a little bit for continuity and reiterate that at the period that we left off yesterday, Charlemagne was consummated as the Pope, rather as the Emperor of the Western Roman Empire. Remember, we're talking about the prophetic fulfillment of the two legs of iron, the one stationed in the east in Constantinople, and the other stationed in the west at Rome. And Charlemagne has been made emperor of this western iron leg of the Roman Empire by treason. Both the Pope and Charlemagne have consummated their treason against the legitimate throne in the East, and Charlemagne has been treasonously declared the Emperor of the West. Now, we'll begin by reading just a little below the top of the page on page 348. Charlemagne did not, of course, object to being made emperor, for that was one of his cherished objects. But bad as the times were, he had so just a sense of shame that he desired the vices of the Roman clergy to be first reformed. So immediately upon taking the diadem of Emperor of the West by the hand of the Pope who crowned him, he first makes an order that the priests of the Roman Catholic Church clean up their act. Okay? Prostitution, pedophilia, incest, simony, all kinds of debauchery plagued the Roman Catholic clergy. And it was a shame to the world. It was known all over, and probably out of a sense of self-respect, if Charlemagne was going to be a just emperor in the West, his first object was to clean up the organization that crowned him. If he had any self-respect, the first thing he had to do was clean up the clergy, clean up the Roman Catholic Church. Filthy debauchery taking place in Rome. Now, it said Charlemagne did not, of course, object to being made the emperor, for that was one of his cherished objects, but bad as the times were, he had so just a sense of shame that he desired the vices of the Roman clergy to be first reformed. They were drunks, they were swindlers, they were murderers, they were incestuous, they stole from the church. They promoted themselves. They bought and sold their offices. Even the papacy was up for sale. A whole street in Rome, right past the Vatican, was dedicated to prostitution, to service these so-called celibate priests. It was just a group of thugs, lawless thugs that got by with what they did because they were alter Christos, other Christs, claiming divine right. Now, talking about this debauchery of the priests, it says, these were so flagrant that he considered it a reproach to Christianity that they should be tolerated under the very eye of the Pope. And so he wrote to Leo III urging the application of corrective measures. Leo, Pope Leo, unwilling to take issue with him upon the subject, indicated a wish to make the desired reform. But whatever efforts were made in that direction proved abortive on the account of the opposition of the Roman Catholic clergy of Rome, who organized a conspiracy against the Pope. Yeah, the word came down they were going to shut down the brothels, they were going to clean up the mess in the priesthood, so the priest sought to kill the Pope. It says 2 priests, aided by the monks, made an attempt to take his life, seized him in the street, dragged him by the beard, sought to break his skull with stones, to put out his eyes, and to pull out his tongue, and at last plunged him into a dungeon. He was, however, released after several days of confinement when, fearing a renewal of the attack, he invited Charlemagne to visit Rome, that he might more certainly secure his protection. So the Pope's screaming, "Charlemagne, Charlemagne, come rescue me. My own priests are trying to kill me because I shut down their whorehouses." It says the invitation was accepted, and the great King Charlemagne entered Rome in December of 800 AD, when the Pope, placing a crown upon his head, turned over to him that part of the empire with as cool an impudence as if it were his to bestow, declared him emperor, and crowned him crowned as such by the hand of God. That's right. The Pope claims to be the very hand of God, the very replacement of God on earth. And when God places a crown on your head, you're a king, right? So Charlemagne's just been crowned Emperor of the West by God himself through the hands of the Pope. Now, 2 objects were accomplished by this stroke of policy, says R.W. Thompson. The Pope's treason to the empire was made effectual. In other words, they consummated this treason. And Charlemagne was made Emperor of the Romans, which placed the diadem of the Caesars upon his brow. Now, if you were one of the Caesars in the East and you were privy to what was going on in Rome, you'd probably send massive armies to overthrow the Pope and Charlemagne. But remember, we're talking about the fulfillment of Bible prophecy here. This church was predicted by Paul to rise shortly after the Caesar left Rome and set up his shop in Constantinople. He who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way, and then that man of sin shall be revealed. So this church is prophesied to come to power and to rule the world before Christ's return. And that's exactly what history documents, and that's why this book is so important. Now, the Eastern emperors were now supplanted at Rome, and the King of France was placed at the head of the great Western Empire. Of course, he could do nothing less in return for the crown given him by the Pope than confirm the donation of Pepin, his father, to the church, which it is said he did without hesitation. By this means he acquired the title of, quote, the favorite son of the church, unquote, which title has been ever since applied to all the monarchs of France who have remained true to the Roman Catholic Church and the Papacy. The favorite son of the church, Charlemagne. Why? Because he ingratiated the Pope, giving him temporal power over these papal states, confirming the so-called donation of Pepin, his father, and making the Pope a king. And having accepted his own crown from the Pope's hand, literally made the Pope the King of Kings. Now, the logic is clear that if a king accepts his crown from the hands of the Pope, it lies within the power of the Pope to remove that crown if that king does not obey the one who crowned him. This makes the Pope the King of Kings. He's certainly asserted to himself that he was the king of Charlemagne, unbeknownst to Charlemagne, of course. But later it would be revealed. Now, he says he was also repaid by the pontifical blessing and furnished with a copy of the canon laws of the church, from which it was designed he should learn the nature and extent of his obligations of obedience to the Pope, and the necessity of preserving the union between church and state. Okay, so this is an unholy empire that has been created. It's been created as a union of church and state. And what we see here by Charlemagne's acceptance of this gift of the canon laws of the church, which establishes Charlemagne's obligation of obedience to the Pope and the necessity of preserving that union between the empire and the Roman Catholic Church, we see the establishment of our first concordat. This is where we get the concordats, the contractual binding agreements between the papacy and nations to make Roman Catholicism the state church, the state-sponsored church, and Roman Catholic canon law to be the law of the land, and special privileges and immunities given to the priests and the Pope and the church. Okay, that's what a concordat is. Every concordat, no matter at what stage of its development, its ultimate design is to establish Roman Catholicism as the state church, and that the state will support financially the church and defend the church, and not only to defend the church, but to wage war at the behest of the church to conquer even more land. So there's much to be achieved by the papacy foisting these concordats upon nations. And we see the first example of that in this case, where Charlemagne accepts the canon laws of the church, which establish his obligation, his divine responsibility to obey the Pope. Now, most unfortunate has it been for France that this code of canon laws was ever assented to by her great king, or taken by him into her dominions. It tied France fast to the papal car, and through tribulation, anguish, revolution, bloodshed, and every form of suffering, it has at last pulled her down into the abyss. The magnificence of her scenery, the grandeur of her cities, the fertility of her soil, and the beauty of her climate, the bravery of her armies, and the genius of her children, all combined, could not excite in the minds of her people a sufficient sense of their own manhood to save her. With her fate sealed to that of the papacy, she and it have sunk into a common grave. When her day of resurrection shall come, she must clothe herself in new robes, leave the papal wreck to decay amidst the debris of fallen and lost nations, construct with her own hands a new grandeur, and place her people where they yet deserve to be, far forward in the ranks of those who know what it is to shelter and protect themselves by institutions of their own creation, without the aid of kings or popes or any other of the medieval forms of tyranny. So eloquent is R.W. Thompson at the fatal error that France made in making its allegiance to the Pope. What a destruction of an otherwise great nation, because it encumbered itself with the scarlet harlot in Rome, Italy. And such is the fate of every nation that signs a concordat with the Vatican and makes Roman Catholicism the state church. And that's exactly what the United States of America has done. Now, many researchers would argue There is no concordat between the United States and the Vatican. But look what's happening in this country today. One must at least consider the possibility that there has been a secret concordat signed between the government of the United States and the papacy. And you're seeing the downfall of this nation because of that alliance, that most unholy alliance between what used to be called a Protestant nation and the Scarlet Harlot in Rome. The New World Order is simply the Old World Order restored, and the United States has been instrumental, almost exclusive, in conquering the rest of the world for the Pope. The destruction of France is going to be mirrored in the United States of America. And we've got no one to blame for ourselves if we don't stand up and identify Rome's interference in our government and demand that it be removed by its very roots and reestablish Christ as the only king of our lives. Now, it is important to know in this connection the extent of the territory granted by Charlemagne to the Pope. And we're talking about the Papal States here. This donation of Pepin was reaffirmed by Charlemagne. It says this is the first area where the papacy could call itself a legitimate king. Okay, but it's not legitimate at all if you've been a regular listener. It's important to know in this connection the extent of the territory granted by Charlemagne to the Pope in order that the precise extent of the papal domains may be ascertained. Fredit, you remember the historian, we've talked about him before, it says Fredit confines it to the provinces granted by Pepin. Speaking of the popes becoming independent of secular princes, he says this, quote, "This independence they obtained through the instrumentality of Pepin and his successor Charlemagne, who conferred on the Pope such an extent of temporal power as might enable them freely to exercise their spiritual authority," unquote. Now, don't miss the importance of what I just read. What has to be understood by this is that the spiritual authority of the papacy suffers unless his spiritual authority can be imposed. Okay, men don't readily accept generally speaking, men do not readily accept the spiritual authority of the papacy. The papacy recognizes that and compensates for that by controlling the governments of the land and then imposing his spiritual authority by the civil law, by civil power. That's why it's so important that we not allow the government of the United States to be ruled by the papacy, because the natural result of that will be the establishment of the Pope's spiritual power and opposition from no one. That is, Rome, the Roman Catholic Church becomes the state church, and Roman Catholicism the official religion of the state, and then Roman Catholic canon law imposed and just simply adopted by the civil government. That's what we're seeing in the country today. Okay, we're losing our right to freedom of speech. Well, Roman Catholic canon law forbids freedom of speech. We're being denied freedom of conscience to make our own decisions, to have sovereignty within ourselves. That's being overthrown by canon law. We're seeing our liberties eroded, and not because just a natural evolution of the nation, but because of the imposition of the papacy within the government of the United States. Are these rights being taken from us? Okay. At another place he says, quote, Charlemagne manifested his attachment to the apostolic see by ratifying and augmenting the donation which Pepin had made in its favor, unquote, but he does not state in what the augmentation consisted. He does not speak of any additional grant made in the year 800 A.D. Cormenin is not more specific, although he speaks of large donations given to several churches in Rome. Waddington says, quote, he renewed and even increased the grant of Pepin. So we have one historian says, Waddington says, that the Pope's domains, or the territory over which he was to be made a king, a governing power, was extended beyond the territory granted by Pepin. And it says, Reichel says that he, quote, ratified the donation of his father, Pepin, by ceding to the Pope the exarchate of the Pentapolis, unquote. Dean Millman is more satisfactory and limits the grant to those cities which afterward paid homage and delivered their keys to the Pope: Ravenna, Rimini, Pesaro, Fano, Cessna, Sinigaglia, Isi, Forlimpopoli, Forli, with the castle of Sisibio, Montefeltro, Asera, Monte di Lucano, Serra, San Marino, Bobbio, Urbino, Caglia, Luciolo, Gubbio, Camaccio, and Narni, taken from the Duke of Spoleto. So he goes to the trouble of naming all the cities and provinces of this so-called donation, establishing the territory over which the Pope ruled as a king, establishing what the papacy calls the patrimony of Peter, or the temporal power of the Pope. Now, he says, thus we are enabled to see that neither by Pepin nor Charlemagne was there any grant of temporal power in Rome. No temporal power was established in Rome made to the popes. So when the papacy uses this argument that according to the donation of Pepin and Charlemagne, the Pope is a king over a specific territory, thus establishing his divine right to be a king, we look closely at this history and we discover that Rome was never part of the donation of Pepin, nor of Charlemagne, and the Pope can't even claim legitimate princely authority over the very city in which he resides, Rome. And I just think that is hilarious. God has a way of making an absolute mockery of his counterfeit, and this is one of the most ingenious developments in history to prove that the papacy has no divine right whatsoever. He uses Pepin and Charlemagne to justify his temporal kingdom, but in that kingdom, Rome is never included. Isn't that precious? Praise God for the truth. Now, if it was designed by either of them to make them temporal princes at all, their authority, by the very nature of the concessions, was limited to the provinces taken from the Lombards and the Duke of Spoleto and held by conquest, but there's no conquest of Rome by Pepin or Charlemagne. Isn't it wonderful? And one of these truths is just hilarious to me. R.W. Thompson says, thus we are enabled to see that neither by Pepin nor Charlemagne was there any grant of temporal or kingly power in Rome made to the popes. Okay? So they can't legitimately call themselves king over the very city in which they reside. It says, if it was designed by either Pepin or Charlemagne to make them temporal princes at all, their authority, by the very nature of the concessions, was limited to the provinces taken from the Lombards and from the Duke of Spoleto, and held by conquest. There was no conquest of Rome by Pepin or Charlemagne. Isn't that hilarious? And I'll bet if Nicholas didn't already know this, he's probably rolling on the floor. It says, after the grant of Pepin, the Pope was left a subject to the Eastern Emperor, still in rebellion. But after that of Charlemagne, his relations were changed and he became a subject of the Emperor of the Romans. Now, who was that but Charlemagne? So the Pope is no king at all. And it said it is perfectly manifest from all the history of those times that Charlemagne did not intend to leave a king in any part of his dominions with superior authority to his own, and even with equal authority. When the Iron Crown was placed upon his brow by the Pope, he became the sovereign of the Western Empire, which included Rome. Mr. Hallam, referring to this sovereignty, says, quote, money was coined in his name, that is, Charlemagne's name, and an oath of fidelity was taken by the clergy and the people. And their oath was given to Charlemagne, obviously. No coins were minted with the Pope's mug on it, and nobody took an oath of allegiance to the Pope. So the Western Empire is ruled by Charlemagne, a secular prince, and there's no provision for the King of Rome, the self-proclaimed King of Rome. Now, undoubtedly, there was a considerable jurisdiction of the authority conferred upon the popes, but it was subordinate to the jurisdiction and authority of the emperor. It was not temporal power in the sense claimed by the papacy. If so, the oath of fidelity would have been taken by the Roman people to the Pope and not to Charlemagne. It may be assumed, therefore, as a well-attested historic fact that up to the time of Charlemagne's death, which occurred in the year 814, the popes possessed no such temporal power in Rome as conferred upon them the right to prescribe the laws, administer the government, or exact civil allegiance to themselves. Whatever power they exercised beyond that necessary for the mere protection of the property of the church was usurpation. And that describes the papacy in a nutshell. Lock, stock, and barrel. Usurpation. Blasphemy of blasphemies. The epitome of blasphemy. It has usurped God's throne. He continues, and when they carried this usurpation to the extent of uniting the church and the state in the territory ever since known as the Papal States, they impaired the spiritual strength of the church, retarded the progress of true religion, and laid the foundation for that series of unfortunate measures by means of which the people were held in ignorance, superstition, and civil bondage for hundreds of years until they were rescued by the great Reformation of the 16th century. Darkness. Because the man of darkness ruled. And he ruled by keeping down the people, by keeping them ignorant and superstitious and beholden to his spiritual authority. And they did it by force through the temporal power. And it wasn't until the Protestant Reformation, a reform that gave the Bible to the hands of the people so that they could read it for themselves, it was only then that the world realized what a usurpation, what an epitome of blasphemy the papacy really was. And they came to the stark realization, the realization that is mostly lost today, that the papacy is the prophesied man of sin. That the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church together constitutes the woman who rides the scarlet-colored beast, of Revelation chapter 17, the scarlet harlot. And they came out of that church in droves. And they proclaimed liberty in Christ. They proclaimed a new king, both in their hearts and over the land. The Protestant Reformation. And it's nearly dead now. And it's time for us to regain our protest of the scarlet harlot in Revelation chapter 17. Now, the author continues, he said that the popes were both ready and willing to usurp temporal authority as abundantly shown by history. In all the proceedings here recorded, there's nothing of a religious nature, nothing that concerned the Christian faith, nothing to remind one of the devotion and simplicity by which the apostolic times were so much distinguished. They were the mere schemings of ambitious and selfish politicians whose sole object was to concentrate temporal power in their own hands as the means of bringing the people in subjection to themselves. We're talking about Nicolaitanism here. Usurpation of God's throne. The replacement of the benevolent king, the liberating king, Christ. They replaced it with Nicolaitanism, suppression of the people, lording it over the people. That's how we identify Antichrist. And it's revealed in history. And I hope, and it is my mission here at Inquisition Update, to restore the knowledge of this Protestant history to my listeners so that you may know who is Antichrist and you might help identify him to the rest of the truly godly Christians in this country so that we might not fall prey, as did those during the Dark and Middle Ages, to this usurpation, that we might restore our liberty in Christ and proclaim him once again king, and to denounce the papacy as Antichrist. That we might use this knowledge to recognize what a grievous spiritual and physical error it is to accept this ecumenical movement, to have peace and unity with this diabolical church in Rome. Now it says they differ from similar acts of other despots only in this, that they were accompanied by an almost total disregard for the teachings of Christ and the apostles, while at the same time the name of God was constantly invoked to sanction every form of oppression and outrage. The popes even allowed the creed of the Catholic Church to be changed by the emperor in exchange for the privileges he conferred upon them. Wealth and power seemed to be the only objects worth striving for, and corruption became almost universal. The papacy was at once elevated beyond anything known in its previous history, and immediately commenced to interfere in temporal affairs. The popes, separating themselves from the Eastern Empire, assumed to direct the domestic affairs of nations, impiously claiming that whatever power they had derived from Pepin or Charlemagne was a gift of God, and that, therefore, God had appointed them to rule the world in his name. Let me read it again. Here's what R.W. Thompson says of the papacy. That the gift of Charlemagne and Pepin was a gift of God, says the Pope, and that therefore God had appointed them, the popes, to rule the world in his name. Folks, that is the old world order, and it is also the new world order. And when I talk to people about how powerful the papacy is in the world and how it directs governments, how it elects all the presidents of this country and the nations of the world, and that the governments of the world are dominated by the Roman Catholic priests, and and a pressure against excommunication and assassination and overthrow, military overthrow if that's necessary, if they disobey the Pope. People just laugh at me. But R.W. Thompson, Secretary of the U.S. Navy, astutely and specifically trained to assess the threats to this constitutional republic, both foreign and domestic, says in so many ways, so many times throughout this book, that if this nation is ever threatened, it won't be by any invasion, any military force. It will be overthrown by the indigenous Roman Catholic people in this country. That our gravest threat is within the country. And here it is. The people loyal to the temporal power of the Pope. The people who are loyal to this despot, who believe it is their divine prerogative to elevate him to kingly status, and thereby to impose his religion upon us. R.W. Thompson saw the ending of this country, and he warned us about it in this book. And it's nothing to be laughed at. This man knew his business. And we see the fulfillment of all of his warnings right here today in this country. He says they accordingly entered upon the career of territorial conquest and succeeded in further extorting from Louis de Debonair, the son and successor of Charlemagne, the right of sovereignty over Campania, Calabria, Naples, Salerno, and the islands of Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily, although Sicily did not belong to France by any title known to the laws of nations, even in those days of lawless conquest. By these and other kindred means, the popes acquired their temporal power and used it so ambitiously and with so little regard for the rights of others, as at last to reduce all the sovereigns of Europe into obedience. You see the Pope's kingdom growing? Now it includes all the sovereigns of Europe. The Pope had indeed become a king of kings, and he ruled Europe with a rod of iron, by force. Now Cormenin says, quote, the sovereigns of the West placed armies under their command, under the Pope's command. They ruined empires, exterminated people in the name of St. Peter, and sent the spoils of the vanquished to increase the wealth of the Roman Catholic clergy and to support the monks in idleness and debauchery. So Charlemagne didn't reform this church. No, the church, the papacy, grew to encompass the entire Western Empire and usurp the authority of the emperor, and then use the armies of Europe to wage war to conquer the rest of the Eastern Empire. The Crusades. And ladies and gentlemen, nothing has changed. The papacy controls the United States government just as he controlled Charlemagne's government. The papacy controls the U.S. military and issues the wars just as the papacy did over the kings and the armies of Europe during the Middle Ages. It's a very closely held secret. Now, many people, when I talk about the Inquisition, the immediate image that comes to their mind is the circuit of hooded, anonymous priests that went about setting up their tribunals and trying heretics and putting them to death. But look, the Inquisition really from the very beginning took on a much larger scale. It was whole armies sent to exterminate heretics around the world in foreign wars. The Inquisition, as we often think of it, was only the smallest part of the inquisitions that the popes levied around the world through the world's armies. So try, if you can, to liberate your mind and to think when it is the Inquisition is discussed, to see it in its real form, in its global form. And then you'll understand what the Inquisition really is. And you'll also understand why this program is called Inquisition Update. The world cannot be conquered by a circuit of priests going about from town to town burning heretics. No, the world is only conquered by using world power. And that world power, for the most part, is the United States of America. And even George W. Bush, when he went to war on his crusade in the Middle East, in Iraq, he called it a crusade. And he was immediately admonished by his Roman Catholic priestly handlers in Washington, D.C., never to use that term to describe what they were doing, because it might wake up the Protestants. Inquisition Update is about world conquest. Inquisition Update is about exposing the Inquisition for what it is, the creation of a global government by the Pope, and through the instrumentality of all the armies of the world. Now, does your concept of the Inquisition grown a little bit? I hope so. Now, influence and power thus acquired were used, of course, for selfish and sinister means. For men in all ages have been, in this respect, the same. That's right. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. You can't trust any human government. And that's why at the end of Daniel's prophecy of the metal man image, there was a stone that was cut out of the mountains without hands that struck that image in its feet. That image represents all the human governments, all the governments of the nations, from King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon all the way to the coming of Christ. And it terminates with the Roman Empire, the two legs of iron. And it progresses to the 10 toes with iron mixed with miry clay. And it is that stone, Christ, that strikes that image in the feet and grinds it to powder, and it blows away with the wind. There goes all of human government from the time of Nebuchadnezzar to the time of Christ, ground to powder, blown away with the wind. None of it is going to exist. What does that mean for the papacy? What does that mean for Roman Catholicism? And what does that mean? What does that mean for the governments that sprang up after the Protestant Reformation, who have become ecumenical and have begun to wage papal proxy wars to help reestablish the Pope's iron government throughout the world? The future does not bode well for the United States, no more than it bodes well for France or any other concordat nation. Influence and power thus acquired were used, of course, for selfish and sinister ends. For men in all ages have been in this respect the same. And it was so used by the popes that the government over the papal states became altogether ecclesiastical. It was conducted entirely by the popes by the assistance of their cardinals and priests, all of whom were created by the popes and were the mere slaves and creatures of their will. There's something else in this that I want my listeners to see. It was through the Pope and through his cardinals and priests that this empire was created. So that makes the cardinals and the priests and the popes the shadow governments of all the legitimate governments of the world. And that's the thesis that was brought forward by Avro Manhattan in his book, The Vatican Billions. He told how the priest, the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, the cardinals, the bishops, the archbishops, the priests, the dioceses were the land under which the political units under which this shadow government was established. And the whole purpose of the creation of this Roman Catholic hierarchy and this jurisdiction known as the diocese was simply to keep a watchful eye on the secular governments and to control them. You hear talk all the time by all the most popular programs on the internet. I'll just mention one, Alex Jones. They talk about the shadow government, but they'll never tell you who it is. That's where they drop the ball. They don't educate their listeners. They just involve them in talk of conspiracy. You can't solve this riddle until you realize how the Pope controls the world. That all of these other organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Club of Rome, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergers, they all serve the papacy. They're all Vatican think tanks. The power by divine right, which is claimed by the papacy, is invested in the Pope. And ultimately, their aim is to raise him to global governing status. The shadow government is the hierarchy, the dioceses of the Roman Catholic Church and the provinces of the Jesuits. This is how our government is run. If any politician within a certain jurisdiction called the Diocese of the Roman Catholic Church gets out of line and starts legislating laws that are contrary to Roman Catholic canon law, all of a sudden they're involved in scandal. All of a sudden they have a competitor against which they must run, because the Knights of Columbus select other governors who will run against them, and having won the election will serve the papacy. But this flies over many people's heads because they just cannot believe that a conspiracy so large exists. But it has existed, and it has been acknowledged and kowtowed to for nearly 1,500 years. So why is it, if it has existed for 1,500 years and is respected by the politicians of this country, why don't the people know anything about it? Because we, like the people of the Dark Ages, are held in ignorance. Well, I'm here to help break that ignorance. This government was conducted entirely by the popes, by the assistance of their cardinals and priests, all of whom were created by the popes, the man of sin, and were the mere slaves and creatures of their will. The people were treated as if born only for the purpose of being ruled and of contributing to the pride and elevation of their rulers. Do you ever feel like you were created just to serve the system? Nothing has changed. The New World Order is a mirror image of the old. It's the same thing. The popular degradation during the Middle Ages contributed to this, and in order that there should be no change in this condition of affairs, and that the people should be kept so ignorant as not to aspire to any higher position, they were either deprived of all opportunity of education, or if educated at all, it was only in ecclesiastical matters and under the special direction of the priests, who took good care to see that their first and last lesson was obedience. That's what you can expect in the New World Order. I'll see you tomorrow on Inquisition Update. Thanks for listening.